Alright everybody, welcome back. So I really didn't want to make this video because I have a feeling it's going to get a lot of backlash, and please don't get too upset at me if y'all disagree, but I figured someone's got to talk about this because I'm getting increasingly worried about the direction that Gaijin is going with Multipath as upcoming update. So if y'all don't know what I'm talking about, this is a topic which has been coming up a lot recently. Multipath, in simple terms, is, whenever you're locked onto somebody and they go low towards the ground, right? And the radar lock seems to go beneath their aircraft visually. That is a visual representation of multipath. And what multipath is essentially is when a target gets too close to the ground, the radio waves that are bouncing all around the aircraft and the ground can actually generate a false second image of the aircraft, which is below the ground. And the missile doesn't know which is which, and so it gets confused and flies into the ground because it's going for that false contact. Just to be completely clear, this is a real-life thing that happens to all radars, even the incredibly modern ones. However, in real life, this effect is mitigated at the point where the altitudes are so small that it doesn't actually typically play a role, unlike the game up until now. So for example, the actual old multipath height before this change was 100 meters. And the Sparrow and the R-27ER and the other, monopulse seeker head missiles, roughly, of course it depends on the missile, were all supposed to multipath at around 30 meters in real life. The only problem is that is just 30 meters average. The thing about multipath, right, is that it vastly depends on exactly what terrain is underneath you. The height can vary dramatically depending on if you're, say for example, open water, or if you're open a mountain ridge. And simulating that would be incredibly taxing, so Gaijin just goes ahead and puts a single value on there. As I said, up until now, it was at 100 meters, and this was a really good balance for gameplay. It meant that every radar missile would be roughly comparable, at least in this one aspect. There's other ways they could differ, say for example, how easy they were to notch, or how hard they pull, or how fast they were, yada yada yada. But at least in this one case, every missile was equal. This also gave a surefire way for people that were skilled enough to stay at low altitude without crashing into the ground to protect themselves and the aircraft against the massive amounts of radar missiles that were being thrown at you. Well, there has been a very, strong debate in the sim community specifically talking about perhaps reducing the multipath height in sim. It wasn't supposed to be in RB, and that bled over into RB as well. And there has been a ton of discussion about it, and Gaijin has taken notice. So they went ahead and lowered the multipath height to only 50 meters on the dev server. That is a 50% reduction compared to what we have right now, and this is a massive issue for gameplay. So before we get going, I do want to say I'm specifically talking about RB here because this is what I focus on. And just keep in mind, War Thunder is not a full-fledged flight simulator. I'd call it a softcore sim, right? It's realistic, it's close, but it does take some liberties when it comes to gameplay. And one of those things, in my opinion, should be that multipath altitude, right? Because the problem is when you reduce the multipath height to 50 meters in this case, you're no longer able to effectively hug the ground on most maps. And of course, it does depend. I was doing it earlier in my Mirage 2000 when I was over water. But say, for example, you're over an area that has a lot of little hills and stuff like that, it's going to become increasingly difficult to be able to do so. Now, I know these are AIs right here, but you can see they are incredibly low to the ground right now, and my missiles are still hitting them. This is going to go for basically everyone. If you are not on something like Sinai, for example, or another map that has incredibly flat terrain, if a missile is fired at you, you're most likely not going to be able to defeat it front aspect. And sure, if it's fired at a reasonable range, you may be able to notch and chaff it, even though that is relatively difficult sometimes to do. It is possible. The problem comes in when someone, gets right up on you at, let's say, for example, 4 to 5 kilometers and fires a missile at you, and you just can't get sideways in time. You are going to eat the missile and die. I've actually got a perfect example for you right here. I see this F-16C in front of me, right? He's only 9 kilometers away. He doesn't know that I'm coming at him. He doesn't have a solution on me. I fire my missile at 8 kilometers. Look at how low he gets, and he still gets smacked. There was no way for him to counter. He couldn't turn in time. And keep in mind, this is on the dev server when it's basically a 1v1. Now imagine you're fighting 16 other people and you're expected to notch and chaff all of their missiles simultaneously. And you see just how low this guy was right here. He was at the treetops. You can't get much lower, especially with this kind of terrain that you have right here. And that's not even getting into all of the aircraft that have limited countermeasures, right? So I'm playing the F-15C, which has the highest amount of internal countermeasures out of any aircraft in the game. You know, there's other ones at top tier, like the Gripen, for example, which have over 700 countermeasures. Now, what about if you're playing something like, you know, the MiG-29G, for example, which is sitting at a battle rating at 12.7 and has a whopping total of 60 countermeasures? How in the world are you expected to actually compete when you're expected to notch and chaff every missile that comes your way? Unlike before, where you could at least load up on only 60 countermeasures, because remember, IRCCM missiles still exist, but you could load up on 60 flares and just hug the deck and pray you don't get high enough, which 100 meters is already relatively easy to exceed if you're not careful, right? But you can at least stay relatively low to the ground and be immune from some of the missiles coming at you. And even if you are able to multipath them now, let's say you are on a map that's flat enough for you to be able to do so, you're close enough to the ground now that you already had cases before where the missile would hit the ground and it would splash damage your aircraft. And sometimes you would lose, say for example, your tail control, and you would just die because a missile hit the ground near you. That's going to happen more and more frequently, especially with, say for example, the F-14 Tomcat, which gets 6 Phoenixes, right? And when you have people firing multiple volleys of them off, you have to go incredibly low to do that. That thing has a massive warhead. You're going to be taking damage from that. I just don't see how this change, especially when we're still in 16 versus 16, is going to enhance gameplay at all. You can already experience this type of gameplay for yourself if you really wish to do so. If you try climbing against an aware SU-27 player, something like the F-15 for example, you turn in, you try and shoot, they fire an R-27 at you. You have to notch and chaff them again until the missile's gone. You turn in, they immediately go ahead and start firing at you again. Rinse and repeat, and this is exactly what is going to happen. Being on the defensive constantly is not good for gameplay. And remember how I said earlier that IRCCM missiles still exist? Well, when you're having to sit there inside or rear aspect, depending on what you're fighting, that also means that once they get close enough to actually go ahead and fire IR missiles at you, you are in a terrible position to defend from them. Say, for example, you're getting pushed by an F-15 and you're sitting there notching them as they're getting closer and closer until eventually they fire an AIM-9M at you. And I'm sure y'all are familiar with just how incredibly difficult it is to flare an AIM-9M side aspect. It's not impossible, you definitely can do it, but it is difficult, and that assumes that you've actually managed to notch and chaff all the missiles before that successfully, because all it takes is you being a little bit off, and it might ignore your chaff and go ahead and hit you anyways. I just wanted to go ahead and get this out there, even though I know it'll probably get me on the bad side of quite a few people, because I think people just really aren't thinking about how this is going to affect gameplay. I don't think this is going to lead to more people climbing and doing BVR. Sure, you may get that for a little bit, but at some point it's just going to turn into everybody slinging missiles at super close range like they're already doing, and it's just going to be almost impossible to dodge in many cases. And having missiles that you can't do anything about fired at you, it's just really, really not fun gameplay. In any case, hope you enjoyed the video. Let me know what y'all think down in the comments below. Please go ahead and get all the forums and tell Gaijin, hey, at least test this out ahead of time. And I don't mean as it is right now, like on the dev server versus bots. I mean like an event, for example, on the live server where lots of people are going to be trying it versus real players so they can see how it actually pans out. In any case, I'll catch y'all next time. So, peace, y'all.